on implicit assumptions underlying software engineering research. Let's talk about research quality. When we want to judge the outcome of a software engineering empirical study, we might use the following two criteria. The first is credibility. That says how much do we trust the conclusions as they are stated in an article. The second is relevance. It says how valuable we find it that we now have those conclusions if we believe them. What role do assumptions play for research quality? We start looking at this diagram on the right at number 1. When we run an empirical study, what we have first is raw observations, and what we want to get is conclusions. And the assumptions are often a means of getting to those conclusions. There are basically two types of assumptions, there are more overall, that we use in this step to get from data to conclusions. One is methods assumptions, in particular how we interpret certain data. The other is generalization assumptions, which we need to make when we draw the conclusions themselves. And the relationship from assumptions to research quality is very interesting in two directions. One is the influence on credibility. As a tendency, when we make an assumption, credibility gets worse because the assumption might be wrong. But wrong or right is maybe a bit too simple. Let's use this 4-level scale for the rightness of an assumption. The highest level is that an assumption might be reliable. Such assumptions are unproblematic. But reliable would mean almost everybody can agree that the assumption is essentially always correct. But it might be only reasonable where most people can agree that it's most often or most likely correct. Or it could be risky, where we scratch our heads and are not so sure if the assumption is really correct. Or it could be ridiculous, where the assumption, as everybody can agree, is probably total nonsense and not correct. And obviously ridiculous assumptions must not be made, but reasonable and risky assumptions are okay, but they need discussion. The other relationship of assumptions to research quality concerns relevance. As a tendency, again, assumptions increase relevance. That is because we make the assumptions in order to draw stronger or more conclusions. And because of these two relationships, to credibility and to relevance, it's very important to recognize assumptions as a key element of research quality, and therefore it is very important to spell them out, to not allow assumptions to remain implicit and not said. My point here with this presentation is that I think it's not rare that assumptions are implicit and are not spelled out. I don't think it's rare that they are risky. I don't even think it's rare they are ridiculous. And therefore I think these properties of assumptions in our work reduce the value of the work of the research that we are doing much below what it could be. And I will illustrate this belief now by a number of theoretical examples that explain 6 different types of assumptions of which I think that they sometimes or often remain implicit. The first one is what might be called being interesting is enough assumptions. The pattern here is somebody does research not because he or she has come up with the research question as an interesting and relevant one, but rather because they have recognized that the work is easy to do. The problem with this is we are in engineering, not in pure science. We need to argue the usefulness of what we do, and too often in these works no such argumentation is done. I find this quite often in mining software repositories types of works. Second category is overgeneralization. The pattern here is that I assume my conclusions hold for case X, where truly I cannot be sure of this at all. And the threats to validity section should be the place where I should discuss the problems of making that assumption. I may make it, but I need to discuss its pros and cons. But when you look at real threats to validity sections, they are often depressingly poor in this respect. Type 3, zero cost assumptions. The pattern here is that the research demonstrates some benefits of something, very often tools work, but ignores the cost for achieving those benefits. An example might be a defect detection tool that's heuristic and that's shown to have a precision of 50%. So half of its warnings are correct, true defects, half of its warnings are wrong, false positives. But the problem is that recognizing which warning is correct and which is wrong has a cost, and deciding what to do with a correct warning that has very low relevance also has a cost. And ignoring that cost means we cannot judge the benefits correctly. Category 4 is ideal behavior assumptions. The pattern here is that also very often in tools-related research, the study assumes that the users will do exactly the right thing, the thing that the tools builders intend. But in fact, for instance, for this defect detection tool mentioned above, it may occur that, for instance, somebody does not recognize a false warning as false and fixes the code, thus breaking the code. And this obviously, ignoring these kinds of effects, makes us misjudge the benefits of the tool mightily. A curious type of hidden assumption is the I make no assumptions assumption. I see this often when people use machine learning, that they are assuming their machine learning mechanism is totally neutral and does not assume anything, where in fact learning is fundamentally impossible without assuming something. So that cannot be true. The final class is this means just what I need assumptions. The pattern here is that there are several plausible meanings of my data, say 3 different meanings. And one of those meanings is quite convenient for me in order to answer my research question. And I now make the assumption that this one meaning is the only meaning of this data, where in fact I cannot know. This may be the most damaging type, and it is my impression that very many people don't even recognize when they are making such an assumption. The conclusion is, I think that software engineering research should start learning how we can detect such hidden assumptions in the articles we read and the ones we write. As a community, we need to discuss which assumptions or kinds of assumptions we would like to consider risky or like to consider ridiculous. And we should start to demand that articles make all their assumptions explicit and reject articles that do not. And also demand that the articles discuss the risky assumptions, what speaks for them and what against. Thank you.